Good day, everyone. Welcome to Education 505 Research Seminar and Practicum. In this video lecture, I will discuss the topic how to formulate a thesis title. This is part of a series of video lectures on how to write a thesis or dissertation proposal or simply research proposal. And this is part of the final requirements of the course research seminar and practicum. And as you can see in the first slide, there are three major items in the outline. First is on the meaning, nature, and dynamics of the thesis title. So this is the first part of the video lecture. I will discuss very briefly what a thesis title is and its nature and dynamics. My argument is that before we immerse ourselves into the how of anything, we need to know first the what's and the why. So we should know again what the thesis title is and its nature and dynamics before we proceed to discussing some of the techniques on how to formulate it. And then second item in the outline is techniques in formulating a thesis title. So in the second part, I will very briefly talk about some guides or some techniques in formulating a thesis title. As I will show later, when framing or formulating a thesis title, we do not just name it or title the particular project or research simply because we want it or it's nice. But the idea is there are rules of thumb to follow in formulating a thesis title, and I will talk about that later on very briefly. And then third item in the outline is the samples of thesis titles. So before I end the discussion or this video lecture, I will present samples of a thesis title from different universities around the world so that I will be able to prove my points that that's how we really frame or formulate a thesis title. And lastly, before I proceed again, what I normally do in my video lectures is write my thoughts on a particular topic so that I will not miss important points and then write them and then do some side discussion. So what I normally do in my video lectures, in my previous video lectures, and in this video lecture is read what I wrote on my PowerPoints, on my notes, and then do some side discussions if necessary. So that's what we will do here as well. So let's start. So what really is a thesis title? So a thesis title is a statement that summarizes the main idea of the thesis, dissertation, or research paper, including its main arguments and purpose. So as mentioned previously, there are rules to follow in framing or formulating a thesis title, because when coming up with a statement again that summarizes the main idea of the paper or the thesis or dissertation or research paper and framing as a thesis title, we need to think, for example, of first the point that we need to consider is does the title talk about or describe the problem or the research gap that researchers want to see addressed in the paper. Second is, does the title give us a hint of the results of the study? And then the other consideration is, does the working title briefly describe or mention the research subjects or respondents, and if applicable, the research locale. So again, it is a thesis title is a statement that summarizes the main idea of the paper. So we must formulate the thesis according to some rules. Okay? Otherwise, if we are not able to do that, then there might not be a coherence between and among the working title or the title, and then the research problem, and then the research goal, and then eventually the research objectives and research questions, and so on and so forth. So And as I will show later as well, the thesis title, or sometimes we call that simply the title of our research paper, is the main argument of the is the main problem of the research. So again, the title is the main problem of the research articulated in the paper in a form of a research problem in the background of the study, and then articulated further in a form of a a research goal, then broken down into pieces in the form of research objectives, and then the research objectives are transformed into research questions, and then the research questions will be the basis of our questions in the interview, or questions in the survey, or questionnaire, and so on and so forth. So again, all these points must be in line with each other, and it begins with the working title. So again, this statement, the thesis title, summarizes the main idea of your research paper, of your thesis or dissertation, and it should be framed or formulated according to specific rules. In particular, a thesis title provides readers with a brief description of the paper. So that's what we need to remember when formulating a thesis title. It should provide a brief description of the paper that will give our readers idea of the problem, again, the problem or gap that we want to see addressed in the paper, or that we addressed in the paper, and then the hints and idea of the results of the study, of the research, and then the prospective um, respondents, or the respondents themselves, and the research result. Now, writing a thesis title may appear so simple for many, especially young scholars. They thought that writing the title is as simple as eating banana. They thought that they just need to frame an eye-catching title, and then that's it. Young scholars don't realize, not just young scholars, but some scholars out there don't realize that, again, the working title, or the title in general, if you're done with the research, we say working title if you're still having the proposal or still doing the research, because we need to have a title that will guide us in writing. But once we are done with our thesis, then we need to come up with the final title, so we call it the title. Anyway, when writing working title, some scholars don't realize that there are rules to follow in writing, that it's not as simple as coming up with an eye-catching statement without capturing some ideas or key concepts in the paper. So again, it appears so simple to some people, some researchers, but I should say it requires serious thought. This is because when we do research, we do not just address a particular problem or gap, but we also see to it that people read our papers, our published paper, especially those whose interests fall within the scope of our discipline. And that is why the importance of citations and impact factor. So why is that some institutions, or why is that some scholars are very particular about impact factor of the journal? Some scholars are very particular, so excited about citations, that every time somebody cites their paper, they feel so elated. And that is because, of course, when we do research and disseminate that, or the result or the output of a research in the form of a journal paper or journal article, we also see to it, or we also aim that some scholars out there who are doing the same, or research with kindred spirit, will cite our paper. Because every time somebody cites our research paper, that means our paper is relevant, or the problem that we want to see addressed in our paper is one of the megatrends and recent debates in the field or in that particular discipline. So if many scholars in that discipline are citing our research paper, again, that shows how important, how relevant our piece of literature or our research is. Okay. And just to preempt discussion, like to preempt the discussion on the working title, or the title is the point of contact between us authors or researchers and the readers. Of course, um, um, when we frame our title, when we formulate our title, we also aim that it should become easily available to scholars searching, in the internet. For example, when masters and PhD students or researchers in general are doing research on a particular topic, and then they're doing some kind of review of related literature, and so they have to look for keywords, they have to look for articles, related studies on the internet or in the library, and they use keywords when looking for those literature. So again, that's why we frame our titles properly, so that when scholars in the discipline are looking for a related literature, then there's a possibility that our research or a paper will be, will appear in the search engine, or will be found and eventually cited. Okay. And if people or scholars read and cite our research papers, then it shows that, as I mentioned already, that what we're doing is of great significance, and that the research problem or gap that we are addressing is a serious one, which requires urgent consideration. So if that happens, again, if people are citing our papers, that shows how important, how significant our research is. And so that shows that we are not just doing research for the sake of doing research, for the sake of promotion, for the sake of, reputation. But first and foremost, of course, that's part of the package deal. Of course, um, everybody wants that, of course, but we should not forget the fact that we do research because again and again and again, there is a problem that needs to be addressed, and our efforts and our own project will contribute in one way or another in addressing that particular problem. The citation will just follow later, or the reputations or the recognition will just follow later. And so in this way, we can truly say that your research is unique, original, and is contributing something significant to the already existing body of knowledge in your discipline or area of specialization. So again, just to reiterate the points, we need to frame or formulate our research title properly, because the working title is the main problem of our research, and it should capture, of course, the key concepts, the problem, the research gap, the possible the result of the study, the subject or respondents in the research locale. We need to frame the working title based on the rules, because look, the working title is supposed to be the first point of contact between us researchers or authors and our readers. And since we want to see to it that our research is significant, that it contributes to the particular in addressing a particular problem, or we aim to contribute something significant in the already existing body of knowledge in your discipline. And so therefore, we aim that our paper, our published paper, will be cited, will be found by scholars of the same interest, and cite them eventually. That is why I'm discussing this point. So I'm sharing this idea to you now. So again, this is how important a properly framed thesis title is. And I hope that you now see the importance of properly framing or formulating your thesis title. And the thesis title is also important because as the first real contact, point of contact that readers will have with your thesis or dissertation or research paper, it provides you with the opportunity to let your readers know what your thesis or dissertation is all about. We have to remember that, and we experience that as well when we are doing related literature or review of related literature, or we're looking for a literature that will support our major claims or arguments in the paper. We always look for the title first. Okay, and based on my experience, sometimes even if the paper contains the points, the data that I'm looking for, but since it was not clearly specified, described, or being hinted upon in the title, then tendency is I normally skip that paper, that literature, and look for something else that really contains the data or the information that I'm looking for. So it happens many times that a good paper is not being cited, is not read because, well, the researcher simply skip it because the working or the title did not give a hint of that information or data that we're looking for. Okay? In particular, it should let your readers know the core focus area of your thesis or dissertation, including the methodology you employ and the result of the study and the research lookout, if applicable, as I already mentioned a while ago. Of course, just reiterating the points. Now, given the brief discussion on the meaning, nature, and dynamics of a thesis title, how do we formulate it now? Okay. So I'm now moving to the next part of this video lecture on the techniques in formulating a thesis title. And I will just discuss very briefly these techniques or this guide. And first is, of course, the first point to remember, or the first points to consider in formulating a thesis title or a research title is this: does your title describe what was done in the thesis? So again, the first points when formulating a thesis title is the consideration, or is that the point that whether your title gives an idea of what was done in the thesis. And this is always in the form of a problem or a gap. So as we can see, this is the aspect that address the research gap or problem, as well as the purpose of the study. I will show a sample later on, and I will explain this guide or these tips or these techniques in formulating a thesis title. But at this point, again, when formulating a thesis title, just to reiterate my points, we need to remember that first and foremost, it should describe the problem or gap that we want to see addressed in the paper, if it's a research proposal, or the title should have described or should describe the research problem or research gap that we addressed in the study, if it's a completed research already. So first is the problem or the gap. And of course, with that gap, we know exactly the purpose of the study as well. And then second is, does the title hint at the results? So if we have the problem, if we have already briefly described the problem or gap, then we also need to consider the results of the study. And so we have to address the question, does the title hint at the results of the study? So you see, upon reading at the working title at this point, for example, there is a scholar, there is a master's or PhD students doing literature review, and he or she, search in the internet for a particular keyword, and And when your paper pops up and it contains the problem and the results that this research is looking for, then there's a possibility again that the researcher will use your paper, will read your paper, and then cite it eventually. And so that will your paper will pop up, will appear in the search engine because it contains the problem or the gap that you address in the paper and the result. Because when searching for articles, when scholars again of the same interest search for literature, of course they will use some keywords. And if your paper contains that keyword, then there's a possibility, big possibility, that your paper will appear in the first page, of the search engine. So, in other words, the thesis title should give readers an overall idea of the result of your study. Third is, does the title clearly articulate the research subjects and scope? So the thesis title, therefore, should mention the respondents and the research locale. So when we say articulate the research subjects, this is always in the form, of course, of the respondents, the participants of your research, and then the scope, and then sometimes the scope, and this includes already the research locale. For example, we are asking about who the respondents are, or the subject are, and where are they located, so where the research was conducted. So it should also be included in the working title. But just a caveat, just I would just like to emphasize this at this point, that that there is no one size fits all in formulating thesis titles. What I'm sharing at this point is the way we formulate research questions in the humanities and social sciences and education research, or even policy research. Because if we talk about, for example, subjects and scope and respondents and research locale, this idea or this guide may not be applicable in the hard natural sciences research. Because if the research, for example, is a pharmaceutical research, in pharmaceutical research, for example, suppose the researcher or the scientist is trying to discover a medicine, for example, out of corals, uh, and the scientists try to extract some minerals from the corals as, let's say, as an antidote to a particular virus, for the lack of a better example. So it's very clear that in that research we don't need the respondents the way we view it in social science, humanities, and education research. Okay, so in this third tips or guide, when we say when we ask the question, does the title clearly articulate the research subject and scope? Again, this may not be applicable to some disciplines, especially in the case of researchers in the natural sciences. But for humanities, social sciences, education research, wherein we do normally field work, we always, of course, have respondents and a research locale. And this too should also be included in the working title or in the title as a whole. For example, if we say the medical and healing practices of the Mamanua indigenous peoples in Surigao del Sur, Philippines. So in that working title, or in that title, medical and healing practices of the Mamanua indigenous peoples in Surigao del Sur, Philippines. So it's very clear that the subjects of my research, of that particular research, are the indigenous peoples, the Mamanua indigenous peoples in that particular community in Surigao del Sur, Philippines. So in that case, I have mentioned in the title the subjects or the respondents and the research locale, Surigao del Sur, Philippines. That's what I exactly mean in this third guide or tip. And then, does the thesis title contain the proper keywords? A good thesis title should contain keywords used in the manuscript. That is, the dependent and independent variables in the case of quantitative research and key concepts for qualitative research. just a side note on this, we need to remember that we don't have variables in qualitative research. We don't use variables in qualitative research, or qualitative researchers don't use the word variable the way it is viewed in quantitative research, because we know too well that in quantitative research, our primary aim in this research method is to measure the relationship between and among variables. For example, we want to measure the relationship um, between money and happiness, or we want to measure the relationship between sports program in each barangay or in each city and the number of drug cases. And so in that particular correlational research, the researcher using quantitative research method will measure the relationship between the correlation, the relationship between these two variables. Without talking about the cause and effect relationship between these variables, because if we measure the relationship, the cause and effect relationship between these two variables, then we are already doing experimental research and not correlation research. But anyway, the point is, in quantitative research, we measure the relationship between these variables. And that is why we have the idea in quantitative research that before we conduct the research, before we gather the data, we have to define the variables first clearly, and then proceed to measuring the relationship. So uh, that's what we normally do in quantitative research. But in qualitative research, we don't measure variables. And most of the time in qualitative research, especially in case study and phenomenological research, or in ethnography, we are not yet familiar with the data the data and information that we want to gather. And so most of the time, these researches are exploratory in nature. And so we cannot define the variables in advance and measure the relationship in the first place. That's not our concern in qualitative research. And so my point in relation to this tip or guide or technique is that the working title should mention or should contain keywords used in the manuscript. So we use keywords in this case. It could be either a variable or key concepts. So instead of variables in qualitative research, we normally use key concepts, or core concepts, or keywords. And then this is one of the reasons why, if you look at journal articles online, and if you're familiar with journal articles, especially lately, when we publish papers in when we publish journal articles, we are also required, aside from the abstract and aside from other parts of the paper, the journal will also ask us to provide 3 to 5, for example, keywords, of our paper, because these are the keywords that represents the main idea of our research. And so that when researchers search for related literature, and if our paper contains those keywords that researchers are using, then again, as I mentioned previously, there is a huge possibility that our paper will appear in the first uh, um, page of the search engine. So again, the thesis title should also contains keywords that we use in the paper, in the manuscript. Lastly, the thesis title must also define the nature of the study and the method used in gathering data. That is why in the past there is researchers, and until now, of course, even in the United States and in Europe and Australia, masters and PhD students includes the methodology, includes the method or the design that they use in gathering data in their working title or in their title. That is why we say we encounter papers with the title "A Correlational Study of," so that correlational the word correlational in that case is giving us an idea that the study is using correlational research design in gathering data, right? Some would say some titles contains the word case study. So a case study on the resiliency of the the elderly people living in the coastal area of Leyte Gulf or in Indonesia and something like that. So upon reading the title, we know right away that it's a case study, and that's the research design that the researcher used in gathering the data. Okay? So with those tips, let me give you this example. I will briefly explain this sample of a working title before I walk you through a number of samples of master's and PhD thesis or dissertations globally. So in this example, we have the working title. We have the title "Lived Experiences of the Elderly People Living in the Coastal Area of Biliran Province, Philippines." Now, so the first point that we just mentioned about is that the title should describe the problem, that we addressed in the paper. And if you look at this working title, we have the word lived experiences. And most of the time, when we say lived experiences, every time we encounter the phrase lived experiences, what automatically comes into our mind is phenomenological research. And so this research is doing some kind of, is employing a phenomenological research design. So it aims to determine the lived experiences of the particular respondents or the particular subjects. So now, if we say lived experiences, most of the time, if we talk about the lived experience of someone, we want to study how these people have been faring or how this subject have been experiencing, dealing with this particular situation or issue. Again, most of the time in lived experiences research, we always talk about the difficulties and challenges that these respondents are experiencing on a regular basis. So in this case, when we say lived experiences of the elderly people living in a particular area, then we are saying that this study will be talking about the difficulties and challenges that the elderly people living in the coastal area of Biliran in province in the Philippines are experiencing on a daily basis. So the first point is covered in this case. The first question, if we go back here, does the title describe what was done in the thesis? This example exactly talk about what was done in the study. Okay? It determined the lived experiences of the elderly people, blah, 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 blah. Or in other words, it determined the difficulties and challenges that the elderly people living in the coastal area of Biliran province, Philippines, are experiencing on a daily basis, on a regular basis. So we were able to address hint or tip number one, or technique number one. And then if we talk about, for example, we go back to the second question. Does the title hint at the results? Obviously, this sample give us a hint of the result of the study. So since again it talks about the lived experiences of the elderly people living in the coastal area of Biliran province, Philippines, then if you're quite familiar with phenomenological research design, then we can anticipate and we can have the idea that this study will be talking about the result of this study will be talking about the difficulties and challenges that these people encounter on a regular basis again. So we have the problem, what was done in the study, and then we have a hint of the result. And then if we go back to the third question, does the title clearly articulate the research subjects and scope? Obviously, yes. The research subject in this case are the elderly people, okay, in Biliran, most particularly those elderly people living in the coastal area of Biliran. Okay. If you ask the question, are they male or female, or what gender do they have? That is not the concern in the working title. If the question is about the gender of the respondents, that will be developed later on, or that will be developed in the scope and delimitation of the study, where we explain, of course, the inclusion and include the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Okay. But at this point, just mentioning using the elderly people is enough. Okay, so and then aside from the subjects, that is the elderly people, we are also able to describe the research locale, the scope and the research locale. So in this case, the research locale is the coastal area of Biliran province, and that province is located in the Philippines. So we have a complete information here. Right? The problem that we addressed in the study, the difficulties and challenges of the respondent, of these people, and then we have a hint of the results of this study again, the difficulties and challenges. That's what we, as researchers in this study, what we will develop or articulate or discuss in the findings section of the paper. And then we have, of course, the subjects of the study are respondents, the elderly people, and then we have the research locale. It's in the coastal area of Biliran province in the Philippines. And lastly, of course, last point that we raised here is that this working title, or this title rather, um, um, also articulates the methodology or the method and research design that we employ. So since, again, when we say lived experiences, we are normally referring to phenomenological research design. And since phenomenological research design is one of the research designs under qualitative research, right? As we may already know, when we say quality research designs under qualitative research methods, we have historical research design, philosophical research design, phenomenological research design, narrative design, case study design, grounded theory, we have ethnography, and the like. So these are just the famous research designs under qualitative research method. And so since lived experiences is always pointing to phenomenological research design, then this working title is briefly describing or articulating the method and design that the researcher used in gathering the data. Qualitative research method with phenomenological research design. So as you can see, this title is not just this title is framed or formulated based on specific rules. The title is not framed based on what I want or anything that I just thought at the moment, but I think of the title based on the rules of thumb to follow in formulating research titles. Okay? So much for the brief discussion on the techniques in formulating research titles or thesis titles. Let me now proceed to the last part of this video lecture, that is walking you through some samples of thesis titles or research titles. Let's begin with this one. This is I should say, I think this is a dissertation, you know, from the University of South Florida. So I think, yeah, it's a dissertation, it's a PhD dissertation, and the title reads, "It's not pixie dust." Well, that's a bit literary, but that's forgivable, of course. That's fine. But the secondary title, the well, we have to remember that there are two parts of a thesis title: the primary title and the secondary title. And the primary title is always the title that comes before the colon, and the phrase or the statement that comes after the colon is the secondary title. But in this case, I should say this is not the it's not a pixie dust is not the primary title because it's framed in a literary fashion, but I guess this is forgivable anyway. And so it reads, "It's not pixie dust, an exploratory qualitative case study of a school-based multimodal tablet initiative." Okay, so as we can see, there is, well, so we can see the title, the problem, what is supposed to be done, or what is done in the research is clearly articulated. Okay, so it's an exploration of the school-based multimodal tablet initiative. So that's, and that also hint uh, as of the result of the study. So it's going to be an exploration and will give the specificity of this school-based multimodal tablet initiative. So the first 2 points have been addressed, and then second, another third is the subjects, of course. Um, School-based multimodal tablet, but it does not contain the research locale. So maybe there is another reason why. But I'm sure that this study is conducted in a particular research locale. So if I were well, this might be this is forgivable. Of course, it's already a good title. It's from the University of South Florida. It's already an approved dissertation. Of course, I'm sure Irene Elizabeth Margarilla already graduated from the program, but the point is it would have been better if the researcher, if the author included the scope and the locale of the study, so that because we know that one of the important rules in writing scholarly papers, especially research papers, thesis or dissertation, is that we always write from the vantage points of the reader. Unlike literary writing, wherein sometimes we leave, in poetry, for example, or in literary studies, we leave writers leave readers figuring out what authors meant by the passage. That is why we have literary criticism in literary studies. So we interpret what the author, what Shakespeare, for example, meant by this passage in Hamlet, or what Edgar Allan Poe meant by this passage in his poem, and things like that. So in literary study, we again leave. Sometimes we leave readers figuring out what we meant, what we mean by that phrase, by that passage, by that sentence, by that paragraph. But again, going back to the points, when it is a scholarly writing, a thesis or dissertation or a research paper in general, again, one of the rules of thumb to remember is that we write our paper from the vantage points of the reader, that we need to consider always our reader in writing papers. And so we always have to ask ourselves, will my readers understand me in this passage? And so on and so forth. If I were the reader and blah, 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 can I understand this passage? Okay. So we don't leave them figuring out what we mean by what we write. And so it would help if we complete the information in the working title or in our section or in our passage or in our phrase or in our sentence. Because again, We don't write in scholarly writing. We don't write for our own consumption. We write so that readers will understand what we're trying to say. Okay. And one of course, the techniques in writing our papers, scholarly papers, based on that rule is that, of course, when writing, we anticipate the questions of our readers or the panel in the case of thesis or dissertations, so that we include the questions in our discussion, so that during defense, panel members will have few questions. Will have only few questions, and in that way, in that way, your paper, your thesis or dissertation will receive just minor revision, minor comments from the panel, because again, you anticipate the questions of the panel and you address that, you answer that in your paper. So in this case, if the researcher is looking for a particular study, an exploration of a school-based multimodal tablet initiative in Canada, for example, or in South Africa, or in New York City. Okay. And if suppose this study is conducted in New York City, and a scholar is very interested about school-based multimodal tablet initiative in New York, but she missed to include that in the study, so there's a possibility that that researcher is looking for that study will not be able to find this. Okay, so this is already a good title, but personally, I should say it would have been better if the author, the researcher, included the research locale here. Like, for example, an exploratory qualitative case study of a school-based multimodal tablet initiative in New York City, something like that. And then we have this sample. By the way, before we proceed, so we say the other thing that we need to remember here is, because of course we already have we already have addressed the problem, the results, and then the subjects and the locale. It's very clear the working title also. This title contains, or clearly articulates the method used in gathering the data. So it's a qualitative case study. So it's a case study design under qualitative research method. We know the tool that, under there are two major types of research in terms of method: qualitative research method and quantitative research method. Lately, there is the famous combination of these two. We call it mixed method. But yeah, the point is, under qualitative research, again, we have case study, philosophical research design, narrative, ethnography, and blah, blah, blah. So this title is complete, it talks about an exploratory qualitative case study. It's really a qualitative one. So we know right away that the design used in gathering the data is case study. And in case study, we normally use as research, as tools, we use in gathering the data, or the research instruments as a whole. We normally have interviews or focus group discussions or participant observation or simply observation. We mostly commonly use participant observation in ethnography. And so next example, it reads a qualitative case study examining the social and cultural impact of sister staff. So just like in the previous discussion, in the previous sample, there is a problem, of course. It's very clear in the title clearly describes what is addressed in the paper. It examines the social and cultural impact of Sisters Club, and then from that we can have the idea of the results, and then there is the mention of the respondents or the subjects, and then the method used in gathering the data. It's just that, like the previous example, I don't know where this study was conducted. So this is fine. This is nice title, but just like the previous sample, it would have been better if the researcher included the research report. And then third sample, we have this title, a correlational study examining the relationship between restorative practices and school climate in selected elementary schools in large mid-Atlantic urban school districts. So this is um, um, a very nice title that really captures all the key concepts, all the points that I just mentioned previously. So first is, if we ask the question, does the title describe the problem or describe what is being addressed in the study? Obviously, yes. So it examines the relationship between restorative practices and school climate, the variables. This is a correlational study, of course, it's very clear. And then we can, of course, anticipate the results of the study. We can have an idea of the result of the study. It gives us a hint of the result of the study. So the result of the study in this case is going to be, uh, a relationship between two variables, a relationship between restorative practices and school climate, in particular, in that particular school. So that's exactly the idea or the hint of the results of the study. And then third is, it's very clear that the research subjects are schools, elementary schools in a particular, in large mid-Atlantic urban school district. Mid-Atlantic. I'm not sure where that mid-Atlantic is, but I'm sure it's a it's a place. And then fifth point is the title also clearly articulates the method used in gathering the data. So it's a quantitative research employing correlational research design in gathering the data of the study. So this is a perfect, beautifully framed title based on the 5 rules or tips or techniques that we just mentioned a while ago. And as you notice, in scholarly writing, especially again in research and thesis and dissertation writing, we don't care if our title is quite long. So in literary studies, they have this idea that we limit our title to between this numbers and our range of number of words, like between 5 and 15 words, and the title should be eye-catching and so on and so forth. Well, yes, that's the rule in literary writing, but in scholarly writing, in thesis or dissertation or research writing as a whole, um, the eye-catching one is of course part of the package deal, but that's not our our main concern. Our main concern is this working title. Our main concern is the 5 points just mentioned again and again and again, that the title um, describes what is being addressed in the study. It gives us a hint of the results, and then it articulates as well the respondents and the research locale, and then it also clearly articulates the methods used in gathering the data. So that when for example, I am a researcher doing a literature review and I'm looking for a relationship between, a correlational study between restorative practices and school climate. This when I use those keywords in searching the literature on the internet, then most probably, or there's a huge possibility that this thesis will pop up and will appear in the first page of the search engine. This is another example from the University of Windsor, a correlational study of emotional intelligence and aggression in adolescents. So it's very clear, it addresses the problem, or it describes the problem being addressed in the study. It also gives us a hint of the results. And then we know that the respondents are adolescents, and then we know that the methods used is quantitative research method with correlational research design. It's just that the 5 points, the research locale is not clearly articulated here. But again, that's forgivable, of course. At least, when I look for study on a correlation between emotional intelligence and aggression in adolescents or in teenagers, this paper will appear again in search engine most probably. And then we have this a quasi-experimental design to study the effect of multicultural coursework and culturally diverse field placements on pre-service teachers' attitude towards diversity. So just very briefly, all the major points are mentioned here except the research locale. So we don't know where the study is being conducted. So if I am interested in the study, so I will just skim through the paper and go to the scope and delimitation section and locate where the study is being conducted. But if my concern is just simply to know the effects of multicultural coursework and culturally diverse fields on pre-service teachers toward diversity, and this is perfectly fine. Sometimes the locale is not necessary because I would just like, as a researcher, for example, when doing related literature or review of related literature, I would just like to know, the relationship between these two variables. In this case, the multicultural coursework and culturally diverse field placements and pre-service teachers' attitude towards diversity. And then we have this title, an ethnographic study of the culture of communication in the Sports Information Office in Division 1A Athletic Program. So again, all the 4 points are mentioned here. The problem that is being addressed in the study, of course, culture of communication, sports information, blah, 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 in the office in the Division 1A athletic program. And then it gives us a hint of the result of the study, of course. And then the respondents or, the subjects, sports information office in Division 1A athletic program. Is just that I don't know where the study is being conducted. But lastly, it's very clear, or the title clearly articulates the method used in gathering the data. It is an ethnographic study, or it is a qualitative, and we know that ethnography is one of the research designs under qualitative research method. So it's very clear that this study is a qualitative research employing ethnography or ethnographic research design as design used in gathering data. And most particularly in ethnography, we use participant observation and sometimes focus group discussions and interview in gathering data from the field, from the research locale. So from my end, it would have been better if this title also mentioned the research locale. Then we have this title, an ethnographic study of violence experienced by Dalit Christian women in Kerala state, India, and the implications of this for feminist practical theology. So this is a very nice title. It talks about first, again, the research design used in gathering the data. This is an ethnography or ethnographic study. So the researcher employs ethnographic research design. So obviously this is a qualitative research. And then we have the problem, of course, being addressed in the study, the violence experienced by Dalit Christian women in Kerala state in India. And then it hints, it gives us a hint of the result of the study, of course. And then we have the respondents, or the subjects or the respondents, the Dalit Christian women and the research locale, Kerala state in India. So this is a beautifully framed title. It contains all the 5 major points that a title or the thesis title should contain. And then we have this study, or we have this title, a phenomenological study of the international student experience at an American college. So first, we talk about phenomenological research design. So, phenomenological research design, or a phenomenological study, is one of the research designs under qualitative research method. So obviously the study is a qualitative research method. Even if we don't read the abstract, or we don't read the body, if we don't skim through the paper, upon reading the title, you see, upon reading the title, we know exactly what design, what method is being employed in the study. A phenomenological study, blah, blah, blah. So obviously, again, this is a qualitative research employing phenomenological research design. So that technique, or that requirement, that tip is being addressed already by this working title. And then we have, of course, a problem. It's the title briefly described the problem being addressed in this study. And so phenomenological study of the international student experience. So we talk about experiences of these international students in an American college. And again, as mentioned already, in phenomenological research, in lived experiences research, we normally talk about the difficulties and challenges that these subjects, the respondents, are experiencing on a regular basis. But I should say this, that it's not always difficulties and challenges, because we can also talk about happy moments, happy experiences of 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 the respondents. Yeah. But since in research we normally address a problem, in the particular locality, and then most of the time we talk how we want to determine how the respondents have been faring, or how they have been dealing with the situation or the issue. That is why when it comes to phenomenological research, we automatically think of the difficulties and challenges of those respondents. And then we have of course, the subject, the international student, and then there is at an American college, the locale. But it's just that it does not give us a clear location of that particular American college. So the research locale is not clearly stated. But again, that's forgivable, of course. The title is perfectly fine. Okay, so that's all for the discussion on how to formulate a thesis title, or how to frame a thesis title. I hope this helps, and yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all the best. Bye for now.